Welcome to Poverty Narrative, Confronting Inequity event, dedicated to a deeper understanding of the connections between structural racism and poverty in the U.S. I'm Jennifer Downward, Senior Research Associate at Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan. Our goal over the course of the series is to promote in-depth and solutions-oriented media coverage of the connections between structural racism and poverty. We have 4 sessions scheduled throughout the day today, and you'll find more information at poverty.umich.edu. In my role here at U of M, I've learned that media coverage of poverty issues can often shape opinions, attitudes, and policy preferences. And as academics, we're always looking for ways to connect research to action. We view this event as a way to connect us, build a network, and to learn how to improve our storytelling and policy outcomes on poverty together. In this session, we're going to talk about data. Data are the cornerstone of academic research and investigative journalism. But the numbers by themselves don't tell the whole story, and data analysis without historical context can miss as much as it reveals. Joining us for this conversation, we have Kristen Seefeld, Associate Professor and Director at Poverty Solutions, Associate Director of Poverty Solutions, and Associate Professor of Social Work and Public Policy. Her primary research interests lie in exploring how low-income individuals understand their situations, particularly around issues related to work and economic well-being. Harley Etienne is an associate professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan. His research focuses primarily on the intersection of social institutions and their relationship to processes of urban neighborhood change. And Jonathan Berlin is the leader of the data visualization team at the Chicago Tribune. He has been an adjunct teacher at Northwestern and Columbia College, where he's taught infographics, data visualization, and human-centered web design. Before we dig into this conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions in the comment box to your right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag #PovertyNarrative. We look forward to having a meaningful conversation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue and want to let folks know that we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. In addition to hearing from our great panelist lineup, one of our goals with this event is to build a network of academics, researchers, practitioners, and journalists. I invite you to check out our resources on poverty.umich.edu. And we hope that you tune in to additional events and find other ways to connect with other poverty researchers and journalists throughout the course of today and in the future. So with that in mind, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And Harley, can you start us off by telling us a bit about your work?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, for the warm introduction. The project that I'm currently working on, one of the projects I'm currently working on that is occupying most of my time, is thinking about police violence. And so this is a collaboration between me and a former student, Frank Romo, who has done some really great work. His professional project, his extra project in his master's program, was mapping police violence, and we keep expanding that work, and we've been together on this for 5 years. I have to give a shout out to Data IQ. They're a company, a French-American machine learning company. They gave us access to that platform for free because they wanted to support our work, and a lot of the work has been cleaning and representing the data. There is no federal clearinghouse of police violence. And so a lot of the data on police violence really is web scrape data that developers and others have put together. And so that's really the best that we've got. And so what we've done is try to layer some of that web scrape data together and layer it with census data and other secondary data sources to understand the neighborhood context. And so I think most people would just assume, yes, let's think about crime, and let's just assume that there's this great correlation between crime and the incidents of fatal police encounters. But what we're finding in the data, and we're still very much exploring this, is that it's far more complex. And so we've done a lot of statistical testing, inferential statistics on this. And it looks like income seems to be this really significant factor, and that there are these weird kind of nuances where income becomes more important in some cases than race, but geography matters too. And so when we look at the geography of Native American deaths, then it's really, really interesting how poverty becomes so important. and that just the deaths are probably not where you're thinking. And I think a lot of people just assume crime, population, that's the end of the story. It's just more complex. So I do want to share this as I'm going to share my screen so you can see our dashboards. And so we've created a few dashboards, and I'm just going to share a couple. We haven't layered all of the socioeconomic data because we're still processing it and testing it and running all sorts of different interesting tests on it, t-tests, negative binomials, and different things for the count data. But it's been just, these dashboards are just one way to help us and the public understand where things are. And these are the three main data sets, probably the three most substantial ones that the public has access to. And we've basically taken and cleaned the data. And there are a lot of inconsistencies between the data sets and kind of the detail that they contain, and what they show. But this is, you can see this fatal encounters, fatal force, and mapping police violence. And let me just switch here. What they do is that in this interactive dashboard, and this is still the same dashboard, but I'm just breaking this out by deaths by race here. And so you can see how the numbers changed as we go through. And here I'm narrowing in on the city of New York. And what this allows us to do, and this has been really helpful and powerful for me, is that not just to imagine these as dots on a map, but to actually click on them and get a sense of who this person is. So this is the name of the actual person who died in this spot. And here is his story. And so you get to see this. And so you can see here that we don't have as much data as we do from some of the other data sources, because some of them give lots of detail in terms of whether there was mental illness involved, whether they had a weapon, whether a vehicle was involved, whether the police have been charged, whether, what's the deposition, like the final outcome. There's lots of interesting things that we can tell with these stories, but let me just kind of switch to this. You can see here in this and this is just focusing on, we have separate websites for the separate data sets that you can kind of zoom in. I'm doing this for Jonathan's benefit. We're talking about Chicago. That you can see, and this is just Cook County, and that you can kind of isolate just the, the black deaths and the numbers change, Latino, white, what have you. And, just from those clicks, you can see how things are changing, both the trends, but also the geography of them and kind of where. And so where these deaths are happening, kind of, sometimes it makes a lot of sense, sometimes it doesn't. But one thing just, and I know we're going to talk about more about this in the session, is that, I think that each of the data sources that we've cited and whose data we're using, they've done an amazing job putting this together. But we've actually had to do just months and months and months of cleanup, because there's still significant problems in the data. Like, we couldn't just kind of take it and go. It took a lot of care to kind of make sure all the geocodes were correct, and like all the, the deaths were where we thought they were, so that we weren't reaching conclusions that were incorrect, because just one, kind of death recorded in the wrong location changed our statistics. And it changed our conclusions. And so I think one of the things about telling stories with the data is just the enormous amount of care that has to go into the cleaning and the analysis and the interpretation. And that although this may look really simple, it's actually just a lot that goes into just even getting to the point of a dashboard like this.
Thank you so much, Harley. I have so many questions, but I will hold them right now, and also make sure I let other people ask questions too. But this is a really interesting place to start us off. Jonathan, can you pick up from here and share a little bit about the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for the intro, and and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a very neat thing. So I am basically the graphics editor of the Chicago Tribune. When a newsroom like the Tribune covers all sorts of things, right? From systemic injustice in the communities that we cover, to how to cook food and where to get the best chicken sandwich. And so my work really spans that range, right? I want to show a little bit, a few slides to you about how we think about data, because it's something I've been thinking about for more than when I've been in this job, is how do we choose what work we're going to do, and how do we choose how to back that work up and to show stories to people. So I'm going to share a few slides with you to give you an example of how we think about the stories that we tell. So stories come in, I'm going to bucket them into 3 sizes, and I'm not going to use the Starbucks sizes. I'm just going to use the regular ones. So we do a lot of big stories, right? Big investigations, and data that comes with big investigations is a lot like what Harley was talking about, where if I want to show how all the communities in the Chicago area get their water, and I want to show how much different communities pay and what the age of their infrastructure is, there isn't just one place that I can get that. So in a story like this, where we say why our water rates are surging and why Black and poor suburbs pay more, we've got to cobble together 5, 6, 7 different data sources. Sometimes we have to go out community by community and put things together. And what Harley was saying, which is like no data set, a lot of when you're putting together data sets, a lot of times they don't match. And so you have to really do a lot of work on the back end to make sure that you're able to draw the right conclusions. And when we put that data together, we're allowed to get, we allow ourselves to give our users a tool where I can enter in the name of my town and I can see how my water rates compare to others and how the age of the pipes in my town compare to others. And you could probably go look up those in your town, but it would be very hard to go find that information and find it in all in one spot. It also allows me to put together a visual that would show you, or to give you a conclusion that would show you, hey, you know, it looks like some of these towns where income levels are lower, where there's a more challenging circumstances, those towns are seeing water rates a lot higher than towns that have fewer of or less of those problems. And so by putting that data together allows us to expand our story and tell our story and go out and talk to those people and talk to the officials in charge by doing that legwork on the data and putting it together. So that's a big story, right? We might spend months and months putting that type of data together and doing that reporting, talking to the people, taking the photos, doing the interactive design to put it on the website. We also do a lot of mid-range stories, right? Like a few years ago, the great study from the, I'm spacing the name of it, from the Opportunity Atlas, I think it was from Harvard and Brown University, comes out, where they mapped out how people from some zip codes have just vastly different opportunities from zip codes only a few miles away. And this is a huge problem in Chicago. And so these academics did this amazing work drawing these conclusions. And we want to tell how that story affects our readers, our audience in Chicago. But for me or for the Tribune to recreate all that data, we don't necessarily need to go do that. So a medium type of story would be, we're going to take this work that the Opportunity Atlas did, and we're going to go through that amazing tool, and we're going to tell you about how that affects our community, right? We're going to tell you about what we found in talking to experts and looking at this tool, and what this amazing work by these academics did that tells us about our community. So so we're trying to layer on expertise and perspective on top of some of the things of the work that other people have done. And that's an example of sort of like a medium type of story where that somebody else did that work, right? That Harley was explaining, or that we did on that water series, where they're smushing together all these data sets and they're making all this stuff. But we're adding our perspective and we're localizing stuff that our audience cares about on top of that other work. Another one where after the Floyd killing this summer, and after the protests and the violence this summer in Chicago, we wanted to look at some of the troubled policies in the past, redlining in the past of our city, and try to say, are there ways, is there data that we can look at? Can we go through how policies of the past have had outcomes in the present day? And so what we did was we called up a bunch of people, we called up experts, and we said, hey, what can we show, right? Can we show how this divided city, that from these policies that took place of redlining, how has that played out, right? How has that had disparities in terms of different people being able to build wealth or get access to healthcare, or start new business, or have opportunities to build, to to build business and what are the educational aspects? And so we tried to pull all these different metrics together. And so our mission was to try to talk to experts in each area, ask them, well, what data could we use? What ways can we show that there are educational disparities that are related to this old or related to these old laws that happened many decades ago? And then we also do things that are really small that we turn around really quick. A few months ago, when Chicago started vaccinating people, this map came out on Twitter, which showed wow, look at where all the completed COVID-19 vaccinations are, and look at where all the people are who have died of COVID. And you see the maps are a mirror image of each other. And so we saw that and we said, well, what's the story here, right? Like, what's going on? And during this phase of vaccinations in Chicago is a different phase throughout the country. This phase of vaccinations, it's really only healthcare workers and nursing home residents and staff that are getting vaccinated at this point. And so I'm wondering, like, why is that inequity showing in that map right now? And so I don't want to just put out that map without any context, right? Because I mean, it is a troubling map, but I also want to explain like what's going on. And so we called people up, right? We talked to them. We said, well, what are you guys seeing in this early data? And why is it that it seems like, things are happening this way? And so that's something we try to do on like a small scale, where you never just want to put data out there all by itself. And lastly, I want to show, and this goes a little bit to Harley's point, where poverty and race and those forces and undercurrents affect everything that goes on in Chicago. So this map on top, the blue and white one you can see, is the race and ethnicity by census tracts in Chicago. And so dark blue is African American, middle blue is Hispanic, and then light blue is white. As you can see on the colorful map, we had a mayoral race a few years ago, and we had worked really hard to take a data feed from the city that showed voting by precinct. This was one of those crazy elections that had like 15, 16, 17, 18 candidates, right? So you just don't know what's going to happen with that race, kind of like what's going on in New York City right now. And the city wasn't moving the data, and it's getting late in the election night. And we're like, what is going on? Where's that data? And so we call them up and they say, oh, we're sending it. And then the data comes through, and we plopped it into our mapping machine, and then boom, it was an amazing moment where this green candidate did so well in the African American neighborhoods, Willie Wilson. The purple candidate is a Latina, Susana Mendoza, in the Latina neighborhood. So it's just a point that these currents, these forces run through everything that we do in Chicago. And it's not just part of one story or one data visualization, it's part of everything. And it's a huge part of our thinking going forward as we map out what we're going to be working on in the years to come. I don't have for all of you a list of ready-made poverty and inequity data sets because every project that I do, that I work on, I'm starting from scratch, right? And that's kind of the fun and the magic of a journalist's life, is that I get to go learn about things every time that I do something. And so if you don't know what data is out there to do the thing that you're trying to do, find somebody and ask them. Right? Call people up and ask them what they know. Call the experts and ask them what they have to show. Interview your data like it's a source, right? If you don't know whether to trust what you're seeing, ask your data questions. Now, where did you come from? How were you gathered? What does this heading mean, right? What did you not measure, right? Why are you spiking right there? What happened? I also think when you're making visuals, when you're putting visuals together, if you're worried people won't understand what you're making, make sure that you understand it first. And then lastly, I think the ethos, good ethos to be part of journalism is show your work, show what you did, share what you did, and link to other things. For those of you, we can share this later, but the links to the stories I showed are here, bit.ly poverty presentation. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This is providing this kind of context to how you're using data to tell stories is just it's so interesting to see the thought process that's going into that and how you're pulling these different pieces together. So now, Kristen, can you share your work and another side of storytelling in data?
Sure, thanks, Jen. So I'm going to take a slightly different tact, and I don't have infographics like our other two presenters who shared some really interesting data. I'm a qualitative researcher, so my data come from folks that I interview, that I spend time with. Maybe I'm in different settings doing observations, so I have stories, and for me, it's about putting those stories and people's lives in larger context. And one thing I always worry about is that in our country, we have such a long history, and we still currently do this, of really questioning and even demonizing the choices that people who have low incomes make. We have a long history of stereotyping, and racism and sexism play into that as well. So to just tell a story could really mean feeding into those stereotypes. It could also mean sensationalizing someone's lived experiences, and that's something I think none of us want to do. But if we aren't careful about contextualizing what we're finding, I think we run a real risk at that. So I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about my process that I try to follow when I'm both entering the field, when I'm in the field, and when I'm sort of wrapping up a project. And I'll draw on a couple of different projects, one that I've already finished and one that I'm currently working on. And so the first thing that I try to think about is, like, I'm not the first person telling this story necessarily, right? Like, there's lots of folks have come before me, whether that's other academic researchers who've written in a particular area, or whether that's other journalists. So I like to spend at least a good amount of time looking at news articles from decades previously, like what was going on in a particular city or a particular neighborhood 25 years ago, 10 years ago, that could really sort of shape what folks I'm talking to today are experiencing. And we're lucky today that so much of that is available to us, on the internet or through libraries. I've also, I'm trained as a sociologist. I sit in the School of Social Work and Public Policy, but I've also really found that I've needed to draw a lot from the work of historians. And spending time in archives has been just immeasurably helpful. I'm doing a current project right now, sort of looking at what the declines in unionization mean for families. So I've been interviewing a lot of unionized workers and retirees from unionized jobs. I was fortunate enough to spend some time in our own U of M archive before the pandemic hit, and Wayne State has a great archive. Just looking at what was the labor movement doing in terms of providing help, which is sort of the question I'm interested in. So being able to situate what people are talking about today in a larger historical context, I think really helps sort of make sense of trends that we're seeing over time. The other thing that I think is really important on sort of the other end is checking back in with folks. And Jonathan said when he was talking about really interviewing your data. For me, sometimes it's about just checking what I'm interpreting. How is what I'm interpreting making sense for what the folks I'm talking to are experiencing? And if it's not, then having a conversation with the folks I'm interviewing about what does this mean? And really trying to, increasingly in my work, I'm trying to work collaboratively in shaping, what the story actually is, because I don't I think in qualitative research in particular, you know, there can be a real danger of being extracted, and uh, with the communities that we're working with, and so working collaboratively to try to tell what the story is. And then last, I'd say the other thing I really try to do is actually kind of find the types of data that Harley and Jonathan are putting out. You know, so a number of years ago when I was in the field, I was interviewing a lot of folks who had, you know, very, very low incomes, but they were carrying really heavy student loan debt, and often attending for-profit institutions where they weren't finishing their degree, or if they were getting a degree that was worthless. And what I did is I really tried to hunt down, like, well, what do we know at, you know, at large about trends in student loan debt. And at that time, we were just starting to just really sort of see like how much of a burden student loan debt was becoming, especially for folks with lower income. What was the practices of for-profit educational institutions? And that also just meant educating myself a lot about the policies of the Department of Education, which is not an area that I would usually go into. Lots of these folks also had really bad home mortgages. So, learning a lot about financial deregulation was something, is not a policy area I had been interested in before, but I made sure that I learned a lot about that so I could contextualize people's stories into, larger trends that were happening, so that they're not just about the individual person, but they really reflect sort of a reality that's hitting a lot of folks in the country today.
Thank you, Kristen. That's just, I really feel like you've brought us full circle to this aspect of how do you think about storytelling, and how do we really make sure that as we are, working with data, that we are accurately telling stories. How are we confronting or, participating in current narratives that exist? So this is all the work that the three of you are doing is just, it's so interesting in so many ways. I have a couple questions that have started coming in. So some of these are going to be open to all three of you, and some of them are targeted specifically for one of you. The first one, though, that we've got here is, Harley, after you showed your map, a lot of people have been asking, how do I access this map? When will it be published? More information along those lines. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I shared a link, and so I think it can go out. I should just say that this is really just the surface of the data and the analysis that we're doing. So this is just a representation of where incidents are happening. So, and this is to Jonathan's point, I think that we'd love to add a lot more functionality that includes things like poverty, education, income, housing status. And so I think we would like to put a lot more into it, but it took a lot just to get here, and so it's it's an ongoing project. So I would enjoy it now, but expect it to evolve and change as we continue our analysis.
That's great, thank you. And Jonathan, I have a question that's come in for you, and the question is: once a story is going in a specific direction, how do you handle that tension between looking for data to show that story is true rather than to see if the story is in fact true?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think there's probably a lot of different ways to answer it. Every story has its own journey, has its own path, right? And over the years, I've been, there's nothing more painful that when you're doing the story and then you find out that your story is not a story. You get all the way down to the end and you figure out, oh, you don't have anything. I think how you handle that tension is you have to have an open mind. You have to be learning the entire time. Just from a data perspective, I'm constantly evaluating whether or not to use data, right? Whether or not to and so if a data doesn't show what I want it to show, we'll keep looking, or we won't use it, or if it's too old, or, I mean, we're trying to, I don't have a hard and fast set of rules, but what I try to do is be open and be honest and up to the standards of the Tribune about what we use. I think that, I mean, there's good journalism out there and there's bad journalism out there. There's good data viz out there. There's bad data viz out there. But I think if you go into it with an attitude of, I want to learn about this thing, I want to be honest about this thing that I'm showing, I think that resolves that tension, right? And also realizing that there's no perfect data. Data is things that someone asks somebody. It's a measurement taken at a moment in time, right? And so you just have to be very clear about what a specific thing shows and what it doesn't show. So I hope that gets at what you asked, Gary.
Yeah, I think that those are some great examples. Now, this is a question I'd actually love to hear from the three of you, because I think this really spans the different kinds of data that we're talking about. But how do you handle conflicting data? And Kristen, I'd actually love for you to start with this, because I can think of nothing more conflicting than stories and history, and how the stories that we've told each other across time have changed. So yeah, if you could speak a little bit to that.
No, I think that's that's something I certainly encounter, not infrequently, right? And I've even encountered it when interviewing people at multiple points over the course of several years, and their own narrative changes. But that's, I think that's typical. So I think being grounded in, in other forms of data, right, is what helps me, right? So I mentioned, like looking for other, quantitative data that puts my qualitative data in context, looking, whether it's conflicting or not. Looking at narratives as a whole, and thinking about, like, does this one person's story, is this sort of just representing, is this an anomaly, or is it just a different facet of the same issue? So really trying to look at not just look at individuals, but look collectively at what the overarching story is, and being transparent about it. And that's, to me, like the biggest thing is, it's easy to sort of report on what the most common kind of interpretation of something is, but it's also behooves us to say, like, not everyone, represents this. There's also folks who are saying this other thing, and but then ultimately trying to make sense of where some of that conflict lies is important too.
And Harley, go ahead. I was going to.
Yeah, I was going to jump in on this because I think this is a really important question. This has been one of the most difficult parts of doing this police violence work, is that, but this is why we're looking at the three data sets, because in one data set, they may be recorded as Black, and another Latino, in another, it's not reported. And that's been hard, because it's like, well, we really want, like, given, and one data set imputed a race, and we're like, should we trust that? Should we not? Do we do external research? Like, do we go outside and try to figure this out? Did the police really kill this person with a car? Was it a gun? Like I can't relitigate this forever for 6,900, kind of cases. I can't do that. So it's difficult. And sometimes I think Jonathan's point about interrogating the data is really key, because that becomes this thing where I'm really like, I want to see your methods. I want to see how you imputed that race. And if I don't trust it, if I don't trust your method, then maybe I shouldn't use that data, or I have to find some other way. Maybe I rely on some other column or do something else, or try to triangulate that. And so I was not, and I should say to Kristen, I considered myself a qualitative researcher up until this year. I still think of myself as one. But to do this work, I kind of now had to dive into the world of Linux and Python and R, and I'm like, what's a for loop? Now I do, and because that's how I've been trying to resolve these problems, and I still haven't solved them. So I would just say one really important thing, which is, I interrogate the data as, in the way that Jonathan suggests, but I also have to interrogate myself. It's possible that I got my models wrong. It's possible I screwed up. And so I think that's always my starting point. I think Jonathan's right to question the data, but I also no, let's go back. I mean, because literally when you're coding and doing things like one period and maybe you got something, but maybe you did it wrong. You got something completely screwy. So I think maybe this isn't good for my mental health, but let's start with the proposition that I probably got it wrong and that I need to kind of go back and check my code.
I debated putting this as a fifth point on my handy dandy tips, but in the journalism world, I have to move exceptionally fast a lot of times, and I screw up so many times. If you mess up, tell people about it, right? Be honest about the mistakes that you make and fix it. And everybody, we all come from different worlds, and we all have different consequences to our data mistakes. But I just think that data, this type of analysis can be fluid, right? And if you make a mistake, fix it and be honest about it and show your work.
I think those are all really great points. I kind of love what I think all of you are getting at is also this idea that sometimes what doesn't make sense is just as important as what does make sense in the data. And that can be really where, conflicting data can sometimes be the most important data for us to really think about. So it's not just something that we want to handle and deal with, but it actually can lead us in ways that we might not have expected and help us to get outside some of these constructs that we may not even know that we were starting in the first place. So all of your approaches are just really, really interesting and highlighting ways to deal with that. There's a follow-up question from one of our participants here, and this is really for anyone. This is coming from someone working at a nonprofit, and they want to know if you have any advice for nonprofits trying to use data when they may not have the time or money to do wide research in the way that they really want to or need to, but especially in the context when they know from what they're seeing on the ground that there's really a story that needs to be shared.
Can I take a swing at that?
That would be wonderful.
Okay, so I think there are lots of ways to move fast and to use data when you don't have the resources to do research over a long period of time and dig through many. So let's say using data means making a chart, right? Making an infographic that you can put on your website to tell the part of the story about the audience you're trying to read. There is a lot of ready-made data if you go a level wider, right? Like if you're trying to focus on something super local, you might be able to find data that shows something at the state level or the county level or the country level that will tell the type of story that you're trying to tell, but maybe not at that hyper-local way, right? So that's a way where the wider you get in terms of the message you're trying to share, the more likelihood that probably somebody's already done that work and has that data that you can put into a charting tool. And there are lots of great free charting tools out there that you can use, Data Wrapper, Infogram, ArcGIS, that where you can make a map or make a chart that's interactive, put it right on your website, your blog, right into social channels in a quick and easy way. The things that you need to know to do that, you need to know what you're trying to say. You need to have an idea of how to structure that data to put it into these tools, right? I want to show that something's going up or something's going down, or I want to show pieces of something, or I want to show change over time. So then you need to, before you do that, you need kind of data you can put into those tools. And so you need to be at least comfortable in a simple spreadsheet tools like Excel or Google Sheets or something like that. To get those stories into charting tools. But so go wider, go older, and you'll find more ready-made solutions.
Does anyone else have thoughts there?
I do, but I was going to defer to Kristen first.
Thanks. I mean, I think, certainly, Poverty Solutions is an example of an organization, where we really try to be able to provide some of that support to nonprofits, to other organizations. And I think, to the extent that academic researchers, other researchers, and nonprofits can keep building partnerships, then we don't have to always go it alone, right? So it helps me if I can run what I'm finding by a set of folks who are on the ground and working every day. And I think vice versa, if you can develop relationships, with a set of researchers, so that you can pick up the phone and say, here's what I've already found. Here's what our data are telling us, but we don't know how to make sense of it. I think it can be, those can be some really useful collaborations. And, I'm hopeful that at least universities with their vast array of resources would do a lot more of that in the future.
I completely agree. And I was, the only way to say this is actually a business about relationships, just like most businesses. And I would just say, there's this police project is a little bit rare in that we're not kind of getting data from a particular person, but we're talking to lots of people who are involved with it, the creation of the original data sets. But I don't do very much that doesn't involve me having to partner with a nonprofit, a city government, and to get data from them. And so I would just add just a little bit of nuance in that some of this is about, I would say, empathy and reciprocity with those relationships, and that it can't just mean me running off to do a peer-reviewed publication. It has to be a benefit to them as well, and I have to give them credit and understand that I may have a deadline. I want to get a grant proposal in or get something done. They're running a nonprofit. They're doing something else, and so they can't get me data in a day. And so I think that there's, you can build a long-term relationship, and I've made some really painful mistakes in some of my partnerships, and I'm open to admit that. But some of this is kind of owning that and kind of learning from that, and understanding these are relationships, and that to do the kind of work that we do both on the academic side and I would say the nonprofit side, it requires a real collaborative, trusting relationship, and it's one that takes sometimes years to build and can be easily broken.
Thank you. These are all excellent pieces of feedback. So the next question we have comes from Kimberly Benton at HAND, the Homeless Action Network of Detroit. And she's wondering, how do you collaborate with your peers to make sure that the data is accurate? Harley, I'm going to ask you to start with this one, because I feel like that's a lot of what you talked about with the police data that you're working on right now.
Yeah, I have a lot of people that I talk to. So I think there are people in this police violence world that we're talking to. There are people who this company Data IQ, they've donated a lot of their time. So, we're kind of making sure that we're kind of cleaning and scrubbing and organizing and splitting and for looping things correctly. But then I use Michigan's resources too. CSCAR, the Center for Statistical Analysis and Research, I talk to them like, hey, am I interpreting this correctly? Am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? And so, it's a lot of plate spinning to kind of make sure that it's both kind of the data's accurate, my cleaning methods are accurate, my kind of modeling is correct, and then my interpretation's correct. And that's still very much, it's all three. It's not just one.
I can jump in on that too. So we recently completed a couple in the last few years, a handful of big projects that involved collaborating with other teams to put together ginormous data sets. And so I think you start with shared definitions, shared data dictionary, right? What aspects, how do you defining different categorical conclusions that you're putting into your data, right? The decisions that you're making to decide, where that race element comes from, or what if you're categorizing an incident, how do you decide which category to put it into, right? And so coming up with a shared data dictionary, a shared mission at the output helps, right? Like you were saying, we're going to go do this, and then frankly, it's also a journalistic ethos: is check and then check again and then check again, right? So have different people check, and so we do a lot of that when we're working in between teams and having to make collaborative data. We call it bulletproofing, where we're going back at data, back at our decisions, back at our conclusions, and making sure that what we're learning is at least reproducible, and that and defensible, and makes sense.
I think for me, because I'm typically working by myself, although definitely with lots of students, who serve as a good way to check me, and provide different interpretations. Giving presentations out in the community is sort of the way that I try to, look to see that, what I'm doing at least makes sense. Like, does it make sense with what they're seeing? Or is it completely off base? And then in that case, what do I need to do to sort of figure that out and reconcile? Sometimes it won't, but at least putting my findings out there, not just in front of academic audiences, but in front of communities that are affected by some of the issues that I'm interested in.
Thank you, Kristen and Harley and Jonathan. One thing, listening to all of your answers, it just makes me think about too. I know one thing that we talk a lot about at Poverty Solutions is that when you look at the data and if it doesn't make sense, that either means that there's something really interesting going on or there's something wrong with the data. And either one is an important point to explore. Just sometimes running those numbers and seeing what they tell you, just the basic numbers. What is the percent of people who are experiencing this? What is the distribution? Where is this geographically? And, like Harley was saying earlier, what is really interesting that he's finding in some of his data is that it's not the patterns that you would necessarily assume. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. It is something that I think sort of links many of the things that the three of you are pointing to. One question that I have been thinking about a lot after listening to the work that all of you guys are doing is, how do you balance this line of respecting people's privacy and making sure that important information and stories are being told?
That's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. With the and I just want to refer to the dashboards that that I shared. It's visualizations are sexy. And so you see the map and you see the graph and things are moving, and you're like, yay, this is cool. And then I think for me, kind of when we did the first run of these and then I started clicking on names, I wept. I just wept like a baby. Because it was like, these aren't dots. These are people. These are people. They were brothers, spouses. These were people. And so getting it wrong. And so I think the ethical dilemma here for us with this particular project is that these are publicly scrubbed sources. So like, these are like the Cook County map I showed, like the Tribune reported on these things. Like a lot of this was pulled from the Tribune, the Sun, this came from newspapers. And so I think that there is a line where, had we gotten the story, the numbers and the points and the incidents ourselves, I would feel a little bit differently about them. But because this is web scraping, I feel a little bit, that the larger purpose is to show the pattern or try to identify the pattern. And so I think in that case, it's a little bit different. I think in my past, kind of projects where I've done more case study and qualitative research, I feel much more nervous about sharing, like revealing addresses, neighborhood level. Like, I sometimes have to explain the story. Like, I need you to understand the context of this interview. But I think that there's, your primary goal is to protect the integrity and the humanity of the person who's at the center of the story. And I think in this weird way with the police violence work, it's actually honoring their humanity to tell the story, not to obscure it. And so but it's a very weird line. it's a real tension.
Yeah, I think, that's something that I think about constantly. And, for all of the protections that something like an institutional review board makes you put in, to tell people all the steps you're going to take to protect their privacy. People's stories, if they're if you really want to show the nuance, get pretty detailed. And, there are certainly times where it could be that to get the nuance and to really explore fully what this person's story is meaning, yeah, you're treading a really fine line. For me, I try to resolve that, if I'm really worried about it, by, just running things by the folks that I'm working with, because, and, I'm working with small enough numbers of people that that's something I can do. I don't have a data set of thousands of people. But it also, to me, matters in how I'm telling it and why I'm telling it. I think, again, I'll get back to this, what I said earlier about the sensationalist aspect. I really, when I'm writing up someone's story, I'm trying to constantly ask myself why this person and why this story, and is it because what is the larger point I'm trying to illustrate and make? And if it's not compelling, then then I have to worry that it's just that I found this story so interesting. But by telling it, is it really just going to sensationalize something, or is it really trying to pinpoint something deeper that's going on? And trying to make those decisions, I think, can really help with that sort of that balance.
Jonathan, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a complicated bit of tension, and I think that plays out in many different conversations, and I guess, for a lack of a better way of saying it, sort of negotiations, right? If you're a reporter on a street trying to talk to someone about their story, to tell their story that illustrates a wider issue, then there's a conversation there. There's a very delicate sort of negotiation that takes place. In addition to that, at places like the Tribune, we have organizational approaches or standards when we think about, in certain types of stories that deal with minors or deal with sort of some of the bad things that happen in the world. How do you deal with that? What are the ways that we can respect people's lives and also tell these stories that expose things that need to change, right? And so the short answer is we talk about it on lots of different levels, right? And I think human beings process the world through stories, right? Like you have empathy through hearing what other people went through. And so the importance of communicating those, I don't think we can understate it, but it is somebody putting themselves out there, not even the person whose story, not just the person whose story is being told, but the person who's doing the storytelling. And so there's risk there, there's negotiation, there's no easy answer, but I think you get there by talking it through and doing what Kristen said too, right? Is sort of testing it.
So everything that you guys are bringing up right now makes me think of, a tension that I've run into in my own work some, and that is, how do you balance out who the data that you're presenting is for? And how does that impact the way you present the data?
That's a really good question. So I think, and I think newsrooms have gone through a huge evolution in the last few in the last decade and a half, because it used to be sort of a one-way street, right? Where the newsroom was the big newspaper in town was one of the primary information sources. And so I think you've got to understand who your audience is, right? And that filters down to every decision that you make, right? And so I think it starts with audience awareness, and then you put the decisions you make through that filter, right? What story am I trying to tell, to whom, to what end? And you try to test all your decisions against that. For me, we have, or for at the Tribune, we have a pretty detailed understanding of who our users are, right? And we try to, make our decisions with our resources and our choices on what has the most impact for them, right? People who live and come through and in the Chicagoland area. And so that's a geographical type of worldview, right? And that's changed. 20 years ago, we had correspondents all over the world, right? And now, it's a different type of worldview.
I want to connect that question to the question we had earlier about advice for nonprofits, about the data. And I think in some of the relationships that for some of my project is that it's okay for a project to have two faces. And so I'll often in, the interpretation say, okay, nonprofit, let me help you kind of communicate our findings on this thing that we're doing together, or at least we're sharing data across, we're collaborating to share data. Let's help think about how there's one kind of push outward in a more public direction, and I'm pushing more in an academic direction. And we're both kind of talking about the same thing, but the audiences get to be different. The findings are connected, but one is speaking to holes in the academic literature and kind of where things are going in that direction. But I'm also not unconnected to the conversation, to the public, and what's important. And so I think with my collaboration with Frank, this really how we've really divided the labor, which is let's think about the dashboards as being a public tool, and I'm working on really weird, academic statistics, but they get to talk to each other.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Harley. I definitely think of my work as having, what did you say, two faces, right? I gave a presentation last week at another academic institution. That's not the same presentation I would give if I were going to go back to one of the labor union locals to talk about it. And I think that's fine. And I think because what the audiences want are just very different. But paying attention to that, I think, can only make the work that much stronger.
All right, so we are going to wrap up in just a second, but before we do, we have 30 seconds. Is there any piece that any of you feel that we haven't touched on that you really wanted to make sure that we touched on today with our audiences? Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. I feel like I've learned so much. I want to thank the three of you for being here today, for your thoughts. I know that I am, leaving thinking about a lot of different questions revolving around, again, this intersection of once we have the data, where does it go in terms of how we then act on it? What are our responsibilities to our users? You just left a lot of different food for thought, and this has been incredibly interesting conversation today. The next session will be starting in 30 minutes, and we hope that everyone who has joined us right now can continue to join us for this next session. You can also, if you aren't able to join at this time, you can also visit poverty.umich.edu after today, and all of the videos of all the sessions for today, as well as additional resources, will be posted there. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and this has really been wonderful.